These two lectures, I regret to tell you, are on the theme of the foundations of equality. And you may well ask, the foundations of liberalism, I should have said, you may well ask what I have in mind by foundations. Foundations has a rather bad press these days because people ridicule the idea that behind everything we think there has to be something more fundamental and foundational until you reach certain self-evident truths that simply gleam and you know them. That isn't, of course, the search for those isn't what I mean by foundations. I mean rather this. I think we need to find foundations for political theory in the sense of trying to embed what we believe in political theory, trying to embed our political convictions in the rest of what we think. So my suggestion to you is that we must think of political philosophy as working on two levels. Those who are trying to develop a systematic conception of liberalism offer first a political interpretation of liberal ideas, and that political interpretation tries to respond to political convictions that we share, or in any event that the author hopes he will find among his audience, to try and elaborate a particular conception of some basic liberal principles. What are these? I will describe what I take to be characteristic liberal principles right now in a rough and tentative way, simply to give you some idea, and I hope we'll turn out to share this idea, of what liberalism very roughly pretends or hopes is true. Liberals, I want to suggest, believe three things. Liberals, first, are egalitarians. I don't mean that every liberal thinks that equality is the only important political virtue, or indeed even the most important political virtue, but just this, that if you understand that someone's a liberal, someone declares himself to be a liberal to you, then you will expect that that person will resist great inequality and count any inequality that is remediable at low cost to be an occasion for shame. So, if you heard that there was a debate about whether taxes should be reduced further in this country, on the one hand, or whether some better scheme of health provision for those who now lack it should be constructed from the money that would otherwise be lost in tax reduction, and someone said, I am a liberal, you would anticipate, not perhaps with a certainty, but you would anticipate, you'd be rather confident which side that person would be on. Liberals, then, are, in that rough sense, egalitarians. Secondly, liberals are enthusiasts for a certain set of rights. Indeed, these rights are most easily described, most compendiously described, as the liberal rights. They have to do with freedom of expression, with privacy, with moral independence. If there were a controversy about whether free speech should be abridged, the constraints on free speech, on censorship, relaxed in the interest of national security, and someone said, I am a liberal, you would again anticipate which side that person would be on. And third, again, still at a rough level, liberals are enthusiasts for a kind of moral independence. Liberals want government to be neutral in matters of personal, private morality. So if you heard that there was a campaign to bring back criminal prosecution against homosexuals, and someone said he was a liberal, you would know what side, or you would think you would know what side that person would be on. These then are rough, general liberal attitudes. And the first level of political philosophy, the level I want to call political interpretation, is an attempt to provide a more explicit, better worked out account of these political provisions, an account which, for example, would say more carefully what equality consists in, would describe in more detail an attempt to unite the various rights that form the canon of liberal rights, and so forth. The second level of political philosophy, however, I want to call the level of philosophical interpretation. And this proceeds parasitic, at least to some degree, on the construction of a political conception, a worked-out conception of liberalism. It proceeds by trying to show the connections between that political conception and, roughly speaking, the rest of what we think. Because, of course, a political conception, a set of answers to the questions I just identified, will suggest connections with a large set of departments of thought that we don't immediately classify as political. And these will include the ethical, that is, the study, not how we ought to govern ourselves collectively, but how we ought to live as people one by one, the economic, the biological, the historical, physical. The sense of foundations I have in mind is just that. We search for foundations for a political conception by developing the connections that that political theory has to other departments of what we think, in the interest of a deeper unity within the general system of our intellectual regime. Where shall we start to search for the foundations of liberalism? As I just meant to suggest, we have domains to search among. I'm going to argue this evening and next week that we must begin to search for the foundations of liberalism, the connections between a worked-out conception of liberalism and the rest of what we think, in the area of thought directly contiguous to political thought, that is to say, ethics. You may ask, is there a problem about the foundations of liberalism in ethics? And I want to begin the argument tonight by trying to persuade you that there is indeed a problem about the foundations of liberal thought in the science or study of ethics. The problem that I see might be called the problem of the two perspectives, the political perspective and the private perspective. Liberalism, a theory constructed to refine and develop the set of tentative ideas I described in the triad a while ago. A theory of that sort suggests a general point of view that we are to take up if we're persuaded by liberalism, a general point of view that we are to take up from which we make political decisions. And what is the terrain of that point of view? It's marked, as the triad of ideas would indicate, it's marked by a kind of austerity. It's marked by a disengagement from any particular set of convictions about the right way to live. It claims, because that's what liberalism claims, and the third of the characteristic views I described, it claims a kind of tolerance reaching towards neutrality about or among ideas about the right way to live. Joined to that kind of austerity or disengagement, the political perspective described, held out to us by liberalism, is also one of impartiality. Liberalism commands equality not just in the distribution of this or another resource, but more generally in the attitudes of concern that government extends to citizens. The liberal political perspective is one of deep impartiality. It commands that government show equal concern for every member of the governed. Now think about how matters look from the personal perspective that we each take up when we're not about the business of government, but simply about the business of living. And if we try to recapture for ourselves how we feel, how we look at the world, when we're in that frame of mind, when we're looking at it through the personal perspective of our own lives and associations, then it will look dramatically different from the political perspective I just described. Because from the personal perspective, we are engaged and committed, and we are partial because we are attached. We pretend to, indeed, it would be incomprehensible that we could pretend to a kind of neutrality amongst ideas about how to live, about what kinds of lives were good and which kinds of lives distasteful. Those of us who have convictions about this, we all have convictions to some degree. Some of us have convictions of great passion. We say that our views about how to live go, as we might well put it, to the center of our being. So we are not detached, we are not disengaged, we are committed, and of course we are partial. There are very few of us who could pretend to an equality of concern amongst those with whom we deal. We have more concern for our members of our family, for our friends, than for strangers. We have more concern for members of subgroups, ethnic groups, families, neighborhoods even, associations of a remarkable variety of kinds. And that's how life looks, committed, engaged, and attached from the personal perspective. I don't, I think, just describe how we are when we make the decisions that form the bulk of our private lives. I don't just describe how we are. I describe how we think we ought to be. And if that's right, then there is an apparent, at least a putative, incompatibility between the political conception described by liberalism and the personal perspective that we not only have, but admire. Or so it seems to me. Now, I think that some of the most influential, at least at the philosophical level, not the political level, critics of liberalism are pointing to that incompatibility. That, in my view, rather controversial reading, is what the group of philosophers who style themselves communitarian political thinkers have in mind. They don't describe it, and hence this is an interpretation, they don't describe it, in my view, the problem very clearly, very accurately. I think they mislocate the problem in questions of epistemology, for example. But I believe that it's that incompatibility, that apparent divergence between these two ways of looking at the world, the one suggested by liberalism, the other suggested by our sense of how to live, that has attracted their attention, and so it should attract ours. What's to be done about it? You see, if I'm right, there is at once a problem of foundations, and if I'm right also, it's a point on which liberalism seems, at least in many quarters, to be vulnerable. What's to be done about it? Well, we can find, in the philosophic canon, we can find philosophers who want to respond by acknowledging the incompatibility and calling for reform of one of the two poles. So you find within the communitarians, up to a point, because liberalism intrudes at some point, but up to a point you find calls for the reform of the political perspective. Politics should be more like private life. It should be more engaged, settle more on a socially chosen form of life to be preferred, for example. From the other side, we find, generally within the camp of utilitarians, those who would like to reform the personal perspective. Those who would say to us, we should in our private lives strive to emulate the impartiality of the liberal political perspective. We should act as if the fate of everyone was as much a concern of ours as the fate of those close to us. By and large, my view, liberals have resisted these calls, divergent calls for reform. And I think we should. We should, in my view, accept the political perspective I described, the perspective of austerity and impartiality, and we should continue to hold to the personal perspective, at least in rough outline, and that underscores the problem of perspective, the problem of foundations. Is the incompatibility genuine? Is it a problem for liberalism? If so, how should it be addressed? I think this is the first of a series of distinctions I'm going to burden you with, I'm afraid. But I think it would be well to make a general and, in my mind, important distinction between two general strategies that liberal philosophers have suggested, not perhaps seeing the problem, identifying problem in quite the way I've described it, but in responding, I think, to the problem I have described. And I want to call these the strategy, first, of discontinuity, and second, the strategy of continuity. The strategy of discontinuity addresses the supposed incompatibility and says, there is no problem here. There is no genuine tension between the two perspectives because the political perspective is, in the following and special sense, artificial. The political perspective is something we construct together in response to the following problem, that though we have formally similar personal perspectives, we're all engaged and we're all attached, or almost all, nevertheless our commitments are to sharply different visions of the good life, and our attachments, of course, are to different communities, and the only hope we have of living together in a stable and attractive social union is to regard politics as something deliberately disconnected from the convictions that structure the personal perspectives we all inhabit, constructed exactly to be something that we can all occupy, and of course the necessary condition of that is that there be the kind of discontinuity that I've been describing. Now, we have available, of course, for almost all of us as part of our private lives, for the lawyers who are here as part of their professional lives, an important example in daily life of this strategy of discontinuity. It's called the contract. When, for example, two people form a partnership, undertake a joint venture, they would bring to the joint venture different, I might put it this way, personal perspectives. They would bring different attitudes about which division of labor would be fair. Different attitudes, perhaps, about the direction in which the project ought to proceed. They agree, and this marks the formal birth of their association, they agree deliberately to construct a perspective on which they can stand that makes no claims to continuity with anyone's own personal convictions along that sort, but which is constructed exactly to be discontinuous from these. They write a contract, and henceforth they treat that contract as an independent perspective. I mean, they don't simply expect the contract to settle issues that it expressly and in terms decides, but they anticipate that when new issues arise, issues not anticipated in the term, there will be a point of view constructed by the contract on a perspective they can occupy to say what, given what the contract says, would be the natural resolution of this problem. Of course, I pick this paradigm quite deliberately. The reason that I name the contract as the paradigmatic device of discontinuity is that the contract has had an important central role in the liberal political tradition. I'm not among those who are persuaded that it's absolutely necessary to call Hobbes a liberal, but even if we set the case of Hobbes aside, the list of liberals who have endorsed the social contract as a leading device of political analysis and justification is very long. And of course it stands in our time through the justly famous work of John Rawls as a leading device, a leading emblem of liberalism. Rawls is our principal liberal philosopher, and he is the person who has brought back in marvelously transformed state the contract, to my mind, the device of discontinuity. Strategy of continuity is very different and might seem to you, I say this because I'm going to be arguing in its favor tonight and next week, strategy of continuity might seem to you initially much less promising. Strategy of discontinuity suggests what, as I say, might seem at once implausible, namely that the austere and impartial political perspective of liberalism is actually something that flows naturally without any social construction, without any special perspective being created, which simply flows naturally from the kind of ethics that I described as the personal perspective. That, in any case, is what I'm going to argue. I had thought, when I was planning out these lectures, and I say this because this ambition is reflected in the title of the very first lecture, I had planned to investigate the discontinuity approach using John Rawls's very important recent essays as my texts. I'm not, I think, going to have time to do that. I am, however, it's not going to stop me from making certain rather bold claims. I'm just going to leave out the arguments necessary to defend those claims. I trust that this will not go unnoticed by those who are going to attend the seminar, and I hope that I'll have a chance in the seminar tomorrow to defend what I'm about to say. I don't think the discontinuity example, and I'd use Rawls as the strongest, strategy, and I'd use Rawls as the strongest version of it, I don't think it can succeed in giving us all we want from a political theory. It can't resolve the clash between the two perspectives in a satisfactory way for the following reason. What do we want from a political philosophy? I'm going to, as I say, be quite crude and definite about this. In the spirit of Damon Runyon's character, you recall, Runyon wrote once, "Shut up," he explained. In that sense of explanation, here goes. We want three things from a political philosophy. We want our political philosophy to be visionary, don't we? I mean, if we have to settle in the end for some theory that through the invisible mechanisms of an invisible hand, if we all behave as selfishly as we can, nevertheless, the state will prosper and be just. If we have to settle for that, then we'll settle for it with a certain degree of resentment, because what we would hope for is a political theory that would hold out to us a vision of how noble we can be, of how grand our association can be. I think Rawls's theory succeeds admirably, at least it does for me, in that visionary prospect. The second thing that we want from a political theory, we ask that it be programmatic. We want it to show us how we can go from here to there. For us, being programmatic, I think, means, because we're all Democrats of some sort, it means trying to see how we can construct or move towards a well-formed society in the sense of a society whose members, by and large, accept the reigning political morality. In other words, we want a theory with what we might call consensual promise. And Rawls's theory, as the recent essays make pellucid, aims at consensual promise. How well it succeeds is a different question. I have some reservation about Rawls's diagnosis of the causes of social friction. Still, I don't tonight wish to raise any question about the consensual promise of the discontinuity strategy as worked out by Rawls. But we want a third thing from political theory. We want justification. We want what I would call controversial force. Whether we are going collectively to construct a political perspective we can all occupy because it has the requisite neutrality. Whether we're going to do that someday, we haven't done it yet, and it's not tomorrow, and it's not next year. And now we have to take political decisions, or our officials do, and we have to argue for them, which sound injustice. We have to decide whether there should be better support for those who need medical care, or whether taxes should be reduced yet more. And as I say, we want that decision to be taken on grounds of justice, and we want a theory which will not only indicate one decision as the right decision, but which will do more than that, which will justify political officials taking that decision in the face of controversy that it is the just decision. And as to that, I'm not satisfied that any discontinuity strategy, any strategy that holds out political morality as something constructed jointly, just to be a perspective we can occupy together, can ever succeed. And I'll tell you the reason I have these doubts in the crudest possible form. It just comes to this, a point that was made many years ago about Rawls's theory. An actual contract provides justification, provides obligation, it provides what you might call controversial force. But a hypothetical contract doesn't. Hypothetical contract is not a pale contract, it's no contract at all. Now that, as I warned you, shut up, he explained, was just the conclusion of an argument, because of course much has to be done to show that I can make that simple point stick against the complexities, for example, of Tim Scanlon's argument, which I believe aims to disprove what I've just said. And as I said, I hope we can discuss that tomorrow. But I'm going to move at once, rather smartly I'm afraid, to my elaboration and defense of the second strategy, the strategy of continuity. And as I said a while ago, this is a strategy that might seem doomed, because I'd offered to show you how it can be that if we begin in an ethics and commit ourselves to the idea that one kind of life really is a better way to live than another, that we can end simply by focusing our attention on that proposition, we can end occupying a political perspective which claims tolerance among competing, incompatible visions of the right way to live. If this strategy, if this attempt to unite ethics and politics, to show that politics really is just carrying out into another sphere the commitments that we have about how to live, if I'm to succeed in that ambition, then it will have to be, perhaps I can use borrowed terms from geometry to make this point, it will have to be sharply different strategy from that of the contractarian device. Discontinuity, modeled on the contract, makes neutrality, tolerance, an axiom, a methodological axiom. If we're to succeed on what I call the strategy of continuity in establishing a political perspective for liberalism, then neutrality will have to emerge later in the story as a theorem rather than an axiom. And of course, I'll try and make this claim good next week, of course, neutrality will take on a different shape as a theorem than it had as an axiom. Here's my agenda, and I'll start. I don't know exactly how much of it will be done this evening, but this is what I hope to do over what remains tonight and next week. I'm going to describe a different political conception from the contractarian, from Rawls's version, for example. Not all that much different, but different in a way which I think will enable me to show the stratagems of the discontinuity device more easily. And I'm going to use a theory, and I've given it the name and the title of these lectures, Liberal Equality, whose centerpiece is a theory of distributional equality called equality of resources. And those of you who want to, who have the time and the interest to do a bit of preparation for next week might look at an article called Equality of Resources in the Philosophy and Public Affairs of 1981, which I'll be talking about next week. I'm going to describe rather briefly that political conception, and then I'm going to try and identify certain leading issues and challenges to those issues presented by that version or refinement of liberalism. And then I'm going to turn my back on politics for a while and talk about ethics. I'm going to try and say something about what living well is, and something about the rather abstract philosophical issues, as I think we should call them, that rise once one asks the ethical question. And then, having recommended some answers to the philosophical issues about ethics I'm going to name, then I'll come back and attempt to show how liberal equality flows from giving certain answers to those rather basic issues of ethics rather than other answers, all in service of the overall claim which marks the continuity strategy. The overall claim is, if we take the right view about ethics, then liberalism will flow naturally from it. The kind of version of liberalism which I think can be established is organized, at least as a matter of exposition, around a certain conception or assumption about what it would be like for goods to be distributed equally in society. What does that mean? And the answer that liberal equality gives to that question takes this form. Goods are distributed equally, resources are distributed equally, when they are equal amongst persons measured by the opportunity costs of those goods, that is, the value those goods would have in the hands of others. So that if you add up the price of all the goods measured by the price others would pay to have them, and you assign to what each person has the collective of those prices, then the ambition of equality of resources as an ideal is that people would all have the same goods measured in that way. One, I find, help to intuition to see what that would be like is proposed by the economists under the title The Envy Test. If goods are distributed equally in a society, then the envy test is met. That is, no one envies anyone else's resources. How might that come about? Imagine this device is described at much greater length than the article I just named. Imagine an auction. Suppose an auction were held among us now, and we began the auction each with 1,000 clamshells, and the goods auctioned can be described very simply. We auction everything there is. You bid, and the auction ends. And then someone says, I don't like the way the auction ended. I'd like it to be run again. And so it is. This is Andrew Marvell's world, enough in time. And it goes on and on. If the auction ends, an auction, remember, in which we begin with equal resources, if the auction ends, then the envy test will be met. I wouldn't envy your resources because I could have bought them myself in the auction. The envy test is met and goods are distributed equally. Certain caveats. This auction will, of course, distribute only things that can be auctioned. It will distribute what we might call impersonal resources. But amongst the things we envy are other kinds of resources like talent. We need some adjustment to the end of the auction to take account of the fact that two people might have equal resources in the physical sense, but one be much cleverer than the other at turning those resources into high-priced goods, and there's a certain inequality there, and so we have to adopt compensation devices. That's the first caution. The second, I'll talk more about next week. This view of distributional equality brings along with it a view about liberty. Because goods are not, the auction will not succeed in achieving a defensible form of equality unless, as a background to the auction, there are in place rules of law that, roughly speaking, allow people to do what they want with goods, save only as necessary to protect security. It won't work because otherwise the auction won't reveal the true opportunity cost, that is, what people would pay to use the goods as they would want to use them, because law will be in the way. And the final point, this auction, this way of reckoning equality, will not achieve one particular form of equality. It won't make people equally happy or equally satisfied. That is to say, it will not achieve equality of welfare. How could it? If you have in play ambitions easily satisfied, you want an academic career, say, which, as we all know, can be lived on practically no salary at all, and I, on the other hand, want a collection of post-impressionist pictures, and we start with equal resources, you will, roughly speaking, flourish in your ambitions, provided you're otherwise able. And I will go to the wall because I won't be able even to begin on my ambitions. I'll be miserable, and you'll be content, and the version of equality that I'm suggesting will count us equal. Now, what problems does this generate? What challenges could be made to this particular version of equality? You see, it's a version which, going back to the three canons of liberalism, which I characterized roughly at the beginning, it's a version which gives a fairly precise account of what equality is. It's a version that identifies liberty and gives that a special place, just in service of equality, really as part of the same idea. And through this particular version of liberty, it commends neutrality, because it will not abide. In the language of the theory, because of the effect on opportunity cost, it will not abide rules of law that prohibit people from activities that they want to engage in advance. It will not, you might say, allow some people to purchase the moral environment on the cheap in advance of the auction. So it's a distinctly liberal theory, meets the tests. What are the challenges to it? There are four. First, someone will say about this version of liberalism, someone will say, it makes a crucial distinction, it draws a crucial line between one's personality and one's circumstances. Consider what I said about your welfare. There, I'm to be penalized because I have an expensive ambition, namely to collect these pictures. But I am no more responsible for my conviction that collecting pictures is necessary to give me a satisfactory life than other people are responsible for their handicaps. I didn't choose that conviction. It's wrong to penalize me for it. The distinction between personality and circumstance is illegitimate. The second challenge is perhaps another way of putting the same challenge. It says, and I'm now going to track the form of the objection made, I promise you with great vigor, by Amartya Sen again and again. We only want resources, we only want to collect things because of the use we can put those things to in providing welfare for ourselves, making ourselves happier, or making our lives more distinguished. Why then should we aim to make people equal in what doesn't matter except instrumentally, namely resources? Why should we not aim to make them equal in what does matter, namely welfare? The third challenge argues a different point. It says, even if it's right that resources should be the metric of equality rather than welfare, even if you persuade us of that, why equality of resources? And now this attends more directly to what I was saying earlier about the personal perspective. We don't, in our private lives, think that goods should be distributed mechanically on the basis of equality in the auction sense. We think such things as merit and industry and contribution should also count. Why should equality be the sole version of metric? And finally, there would be a challenge to the built-in notion of neutrality and tolerance, and the challenge would go like this, bringing us all the way back to the problem of the two perspectives. We each know that some ways of life are contemptible and degrading. We might differ. Some of us think the life of a homosexual is debased. Others think, here I feel very much the target, others think that a life of consumer materialism is terminal depravity. I mean, there are people who wish to own the latest computer, no matter how many they already have, or the most interesting piece of electronic music producing apparatus. And this surely is a miserable, misguided way. Why should we not, for the first group, prohibit homosexuality? Why should we not, for the poor souls, slaves to consumer materialism of the electronics subcategory? Why should we not relieve them of the opportunity to acquire these goods simply by prohibiting this or perhaps taxing them into the ground? We know, don't we, that these are depraved. We know that with greater conviction, remind ourselves of what we think when we lead our own lives. We are more certain that this life of consumer materialism is depraved than we are that liberalism is worth following. So why then should we adopt this liberal political? Here we have now four challenges, and it's at this point, as I said, I hope that at least one of these challenges sounds arresting to each of you. I'm now going to turn my back on them with the promise of returning to them next week, because I now want to consider in some further depth the whole question that I suggest to you, and I try and make this good next week, set of questions on which I think the correct response to these challenges turns. And these are questions of philosophical ethics. Some distinctions, some more distinctions. Let's say, following familiar lines, that ethics, which is the general subject of how we should live, has two parts. Its third-person part is called morality. How we should treat others, what call they have upon us, how we should respond to their concerns, even if necessary, at the cost of our own. I'll say almost nothing about third-person ethics in these lectures. The second part of ethics is first-person ethics, or, slightly less attractive phrase, but it's come into some use, well-being. That is, the study of what our own good consists in, of what kinds of lives we should aim at, not out of concern for the demands of others, but out of concern for ourselves that we lead the right kind of life. And it's well-being that I'm going to talk about, and I commend to you yet another one. I commend to you this distinction. I'm going to argue up to a point and then simply assume that there are two senses of well-being and that it's crucial to keep them apart and that there is no way that I can yet see to bring them together. The first I'll call volitional well-being, and the second critical well-being. The distinction I have in mind, I hope better words for it will come out of the discussions, but the distinction that I have in mind is, at bottom, a distinction in, for example, how I regard the things which will contribute to a better life for me. Some of the things I hope to have are such that I think my life will go better if I have them because I want them. Other things are such that I think my life will go better if I have them because I should want them. Now, there are many things this distinction is not, and I have to take some care to separate them out. Perhaps I can start simply by giving you some examples, and this is autobiographical. This is in no way meant to be an argument for these, but simply to illustrate the distinction I've just drawn, and to perhaps give you some sense of the character of the distinction, simply by reporting how things seem to me. There are many, many things that I want to happen in my life, and quite a few that I want not to happen. Among the latter is any more trips to the dentist. There have been quite enough of that, thank you. I would like to make some progress on sailing. It's an ambition of mine to sail well, and I can't. There are films I'd like to see and places I'd like to go. Now, it is true of all of these things that I want them, but I don't believe my life would be in any sense a worse life if I didn't want them. I mean, if I want them, then perhaps my life goes worse if I don't have them. But there is no way in which I could regard my life, look back and say, well, thank heavens I want to sail, because if I didn't want to sail, there'd be something wrong with me in that dimension. And if sailing is too attractive, to some of you, I hope it is, too attractive to put in that category, I remind you, you may not believe it, some people collect matchbook covers and put them in books. Now, by way of contrast, I'll tell you things, again, no argument, simply as illustrations. I'll tell you things that I do count as much more, as important in the critical sense. I want to have a certain connection, a certain kind of relationship with my children. I want to have a certain kind of ambition in my work. I want to have, this is the most ludicrous of all, I want somehow to achieve even a feeble grasp of the state of contemporary science before I'm done. These are things, and you will have different things, these are things such that I do think that I should have these things in my life. That these are among the things such that a life that lacks them is a life to be regretted. And that's the distinction. You see, it's not the distinction between what I do want and what I really ought to want. That's not the distinction. Because I don't say that I ought not to want to avoid the dentist. I ought not to want to say, oh well. There's nothing wrong with wanting that. As Bernard Williams has reminded us countless occasions, a life that was given over only to things that you think you ought to want would be a grotesque aberration of a life. No, that isn't the distinction. Neither is it the distinction, however, at least as these terms are commonly used, between the subjective and the objective amongst things we value. There's a certain point to that distinction. There is a sense in which what I call the volitional wants is subjective, one sense of that many-sensed word. That is, as I say, I just want it. And in the case of the things I put under the category of things I ought to want, that is, things that affect what I called my critical well-being, I include the idea it goes with the territory that I might be wrong, that there is a getting it right and a getting it wrong. But even the critical side of things I don't by any means think is objective in the sense of impersonal. It's not part of my thought, in fact, that everyone has a reason to want me to have a close association with my children, for example. I don't even think that's particularly important for them, but I think it's very important for me. Well, I hope I've communicated this distinction, at least the rough outlines of it. I also hope that the use I make of it, mainly next week, will give you a sharper sense of it. I think, and I'll close elaborating this thought, I think that there are profound mysteries. The idea that my life is actually something that can be better or worse in a non-experiential way, that I can enjoy my life and yet, towards the end, perhaps, in a moment of despair, come to realize that it's gone wrong and fall into despair. That strikes me as a very mysterious idea, deeply problematic. It invites skepticism. It indeed has attracted skepticism. The occasions on which we dwell upon what I've called our critical well-being, I think characteristically very few, at least in healthy people there are very few. But when they arise, I talked recently to somebody wrestling with the problem whether to leave a perfectly satisfactory, happy, fully engaged life to go and live in Israel. And that person was plainly approaching this as if this was a question of great moment of this sort, not predicting what would lead to happiness or enjoyment, but just saying, is this the kind of a thing which I really have to do in order to have a satisfactory life? It invites a certain kind of skepticism of a familiar sort. I'm not going to try and defend it against skepticism. I'm going actually to assume that this idea plays some role in enough of our lives so that we can take on various problems about it. I'm rather going to try and identify those problems, assuming that we can make sense, that this is an idea which has us in a grip. Then, what sense are we to make of it? How can we identify the character and structure of this kind of value? Indeed, what mode of value is it that we could conceive ourselves to be talking about? Here are two questions, and I'm going to begin next week by talking about these questions in great detail. Well, a little more detail than now. Here are the two questions. First, a question about the source or character of this critical value. We We, of course, understand that anybody who takes this notion seriously thinks that there are many components of a good life, many things a good life ought to have, and perhaps, possibly, probably, many different good lives a person can have, perhaps even, though I would wonder about this, wrong to say that there's one best, just a range of good lives the person has to choose amongst. But we can look upon these lives in two ways. We can look upon a life whose goodness we're calling into question as a series of events and experiences and achievements, there, as it were, the product of the life. And we can ask, are those experiences and events and achievements the kind that a successful life in which someone could take pride ought to have? Then we have to take account of another dimension, and that is the agent's attitude towards these events and experiences and achievements. What shall we say about that? Because after all, the agent will have attitudes. The agent will have taken up certain ambitions, or endorsed certain achievements, or rejected others, or counted some that we think important as of no value at all. How shall we understand the union of the attitudes, let's call it, to pick the weakest term, the endorsement by the agent of the experiences? What is the connection between that endorsement and the value of the experiences itself? We have to choose, it seems to me, between two models of that relationship. The first, you might say, is additive. It says, of course, the life goes better that has all these good things in it if the agent understands this. And then that's even better. It's the frosting, you might say, on the cake. The other way of understanding this makes the attitudes more constitutive of value and says the endorsement is a screen so that nothing can count as making a life better unless it is, the dimension of endorsement will occupy us next week, but unless there is something there which we can describe as a recognition by the agent. This will become of crucial importance when we consider, back to the political dimension, paternalism. The second general question I'll have to describe more briefly. Second general question, still mysteries about the idea of critical value in our life. To put it very crudely, are the criteria that we ought to use to decide whether a life is the right kind of life to lead, are these criteria transcendent in the sense of timeless? Are they the same criteria? Or do the criteria themselves include reference to the particular circumstances in which people live, so that the life that would be good under some circumstances, the criteria that would be right to apply under some circumstances would be different from those that would be right to apply under others? The difference is this, I'll just say this, the difference is this. If one had a view that the criteria remain the same, the view that one would take, for example, if one held a crude version of ethical hedonism and thought only pleasure made a life good, then one would treat all the circumstances of one's life, resources, talents, and culture, simply as limitations on how good a life one could lead. These would be things that prevented you from leading as good a life as you could lead in other circumstances you could describe. But if the view which I'm going to commend, and which anyway I bet most of you would be drawn to, is right, namely that the criteria of a good life themselves depend on circumstance, because living well is responding to one's environment, or that's an important part of it, then the story becomes much more complex because the circumstances in which we live are not simply limitations, but parameters of the good life. That is, we have to find some way to bring an account of circumstances into the criteria, and that's a daunting project, a project that ethics must face. And that will become important when we consider how we should think of resources, should we think of resources as the correct metric of equality. Well, I'm going to give you my answers to these two questions and give you some examples which I hope will bring them more to life than I've been able to do in this rather abstract account this evening. And then I'm going to turn back to the four challenges to liberal equality and attempt to show the pertinence of the ethical issues to the resolution of those. And that's all that I promise, just in case I'm not talked out of everything I've said tonight in the seminar tomorrow. If that happens next week, I will tell you how the Celtics can beat the Lakers next year. Thank you.
Professor Dworkin is going to take questions, but I'll ask your indulgence for one short story. It's an embarrassment to me and a credit, I think, to Professor Dworkin. At exactly 8:25, I was sorting through the papers I brought with me to find a piece to write on, and I discovered that I was reading a very carefully constructed, crisp outline. Professor Dworkin's outline. It took 3 or 4 more minutes, because I'm quite slow, to discover that I had picked it up with my papers after introducing him. Do you know that sinking feeling when you've just done something impossibly dumb? So I said, well, he's doing quite well. I said, I think I should select a point of intervention here. There's a cost and a possible benefit. The cost is that you distract the audience, you distract Professor Dworkin. You could pretend to adjust the microphone, or perhaps introduce a tape recorder into the proceedings or something, pretend to be an engineer. But that will distract everybody. And I decided finally that, well, if the cost of interference appears to be less than the benefit that it appears Professor Dworkin might gain from my intervention, I will intervene, but until that point appears to arrive, I will hold my counsel. So I sat there, terrified, listening and occasionally peeking at the outline to see if he was wandering around. The moment never came. I think that suggests that although I certainly owe Professor Dworkin an apology, neither of us owes you an apology. I suggest we applaud him again. You can grade him separately next week. Please, I think I'll let... No. I want to try you again. Absolutely. That's all of them. Questions, please.
What I really had was answers to the questions, and no one should tell Professor Dennett this story. Are there any questions? I'm sorry. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm sorry, can you speak a bit louder? that after next week, but because I'm going to talk about some of the issues you have raised next week. Still, let me just, can I just note that a certain number of bodies are buried in the word earn, because you suggest, in the form of your question does, I don't know whether you mean to suggest, that if I receive a salary, I'm an investment banker, let's say, and receive a salary of, what is it, $2 million a month or something, you suggest that I have earned it, and that word earn suggests it's mine, morally mine. But of course there's a different way to describe it. You might say, part of it's mine, and part of it I hold in trust until tax day. Because it's not really mine at all. It's just more convenient that it come to me as the placeholder. Now, nothing should turn on using the word earn if we mean morally mine, because that would be begging the question. So we have to take the word earn out if it carries that sense, and just say, is there something wrong with an economic system, wrong in what you call the ethical sense? Is there something unjust, let's say, about an economic and legal system in which people are paid more than they are entitled to have for a job, on the understanding that it's only temporarily in their possession? And I don't see any reason for thinking offhand or in advance there's anything morally wrong with that. Everything depends upon the figures. I mean, if you add to your argument that someone who does that job has a moral right to no less than $2 million a month for it, then you owe us an argument. Yes.
Do you think that redistributive programs damage the economy and the standard of life for everyone? And so, how concerned are you about that?
Well, doesn't that depend on, you've asked about redistributive programs in general, and I'm tempted to give the flip answer. Some of them probably do, and others probably don't. And if they did, I would be concerned. And my concern, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be amusing about that, but my concern would have two dimensions. That is, I wouldn't automatically assume that as soon as it had been shown that GNP was lower in consequence of a redistributed program, that the argument was over, the jury was back in, the program was no good. I wouldn't assume that. I mean, I would be concerned, and I would therefore say, is this the best way? I'd ask two questions. Is the redistribution required by justice? And in this country, I'm sure I'd come to a positive answer because we don't redistribute enough. And then I'd ask the important question, the question that I think will figure in the coming presidential election, namely, is there a more efficient way of redistributing it, or perhaps is there a more efficient way of achieving a little less injustice that doesn't use the method of redistribution? I mean, we're back in a way connected to the last question, because there is something quite clumsy about redistribution. You are making people trustees of things that aren't morally theirs. And maybe there's a way that would do that without the cost inefficiency, because you immediately see an inefficiency in the process, namely the friction of all that. I'm afraid that's not a direct answer to your question, but are there any others? Yes.
In your option metaphor,
Yes.
what characteristics, comparing that thought experiment that you have about each of the individuals? And as you mentioned, certain things that are important, I'm wondering what your image of those individuals is. Or taking the option. How different are they? Or similar? How do you into it?
Well, I think, as I'm not sure how much it matters, so let's say that they're rather different one from another. They have different ambitions. Some of them see various kinds of life as best for them, and others sharply different kinds of lives. Is that the sort of assumption that you're thinking about?
I was wondering why you think that's the correct assumption to make, that those who participate in the auction will be so different rather than the same. I was just wondering how you get there.
I don't think I make that assumption. I was simply saying that the scheme is compatible with that assumption. It's also compatible with the assumption that they're very similar, isn't it? That is, what I meant by my answer was, I don't think I need make any assumption of that sort to let the argument go through. But perhaps you see a reason why I do have to make an assumption. And then you'd wonder why I made the one I did. Is that right?
Well, you were using the auction as a metaphor, which was that purchase. That is, if you want to think about starting with 1,000 plants and that we want to interact with one another in a way that was trading plants back and forth. And I thought that probably had something to do about what these individuals kind of thought and how they should relate.
I see. Yeah. Yes. Well, you remember I described, I think I see the point of the question, and maybe I'll say something about community next week if I can find time to bring it in. But the metaphor, it isn't exactly a metaphor, you see. I introduced the idea rather quickly of the opportunity cost test of distributive equality. I introduced it in 3 stages. First, by giving a more or less formal characterization of it using the idea of opportunity cost. Then I introduced the idea of the envy test. And then in answer to the question I put to myself, how could we imagine an envy-free distribution taking place? I described this. Now, of course, who could anticipate anything like this happening in ordinary life? So it isn't that I have in the back of my mind a desire to run social life on an auction kind of basis. But still there is a hook in your question which sinks in, because it's perfectly true that you begin to think about distributional equality at all if you're into the business of mine and thine, right? I mean, if you have it in mind that in some way we're going to have to first distribute some property into private ownership, and I use a rather generous term, private ownership, so it can include rights and things, even political rights and things. We're going to have to distribute things into private ownership, and secondly, we're going to have to justify the distribution on a person-by-person basis. Right. Now, and I know that some people will say, why must we do that? Why must we think of the individual as the unit of account, let's say, where justice is concerned? And there's an important discussion to be had about that. But I don't think, and this is perhaps where I disagree with you, I don't think that taking one side or the other rests on any view about what people are like. That is, I think I could have the view that people, indeed I have a view rather close to this, that people don't have sets of ambitions and goals which take themselves as the unit of account. They don't do that characteristically. We want things to happen in our community, and we don't isolate ourselves as the beneficiary of them. I'd rather agree with that point. But I don't think that assumption, even if I joined in it fully, would generate the conclusion that we no longer should think about distributive justice in the way in which I described. Yes?
Same idea as the auction. You said that focused on the goal and product of the auction, primarily that people would be situated differently.
Yes.
Wondering, sort of along the lines, you suggest yourself, come to yourself, regarding other smaller spheres. But if there's anything previous or that justifies that people, the situatedness of people in your auction, that is, what traditions are driving your postulation of opportunity as ideas?
I'm not quite with you. What you're asking why? I assume that people start off equal in this auction? Well, because it's more, I think, a device to give a sense to my notion about what equality is. So I'm still at the point of trying to identify what counts as equality, and I think it's quite reasonable to start by assuming an equal distribution of abstract resources, trying to give sense to this account, which would have more bite when resources are not abstract but concrete, of continuing distributional equality. Now, of course, perhaps this is what you're suggesting, of course, if I meant the auction to serve as an argument for equality, then I would have begged the question by giving everyone an equal number of clamshells. But I don't mean it to serve as an argument for equality. I mean it's a device to offer a particular interpretation of equality, and an argument for equality has to come in some other way. Right? Okay. Yes?
One of the three elements in your triad that you used to describe liberalism
Yes.
included neutral government and treating those underneath government as equal.
Yes.
How do you square that point of view with what I think is the general current conception of liberalism, which includes an activist government attempting to either rectify wrongs or do other things in pursuit of higher goals? Or alternatively asked, do you have a liberalism which is different from the liberalism that I think about when I think about liberals in U.S.
Because you would add to the three characteristics I offered, you would add a fourth, would you? That liberals believe in intervention by government through regulation and so forth. Is that what you're suggesting? And so you don't recognize my three without that fourth?
It seems to me that the fourth would bring you closer to reality, my idea of what liberalism is based on.
Yes. Well, you may be right. You see, I would like to think of that as at a different, what we're calling the fourth strand, as at a different level. That is, I would like to think that that's much more instrumental. That the question of when government should intervene, say through regulation, taxation, say through either sponsoring affirmative action programs or encouraging them, how far government should intervene in that way is a question of tactics. It's a question of whether the constitutive three principles are best served in that strategy, or whether, as might be happening now, they're better served in other ways. So I would rather myself not make that, as it were, part of an account of what liberalism is, but rather a question to which the answer might change decade to decade. How should liberalism be pursued? Yes.
Your remarks made me think of friends who are politically liberal and personally very conservative. And that made me wonder about friends who were the other way around, who was politically conservative and more liberal in their personal life. I wondered if that could be taken from the individual level to the level of political theory. We could learn something important from looking at the mirror image of what we look at.
Well, can you go on a bit? What would the mirror image? Well, first of all, can you explain why what I said reminded you of conservatism personally? Are you talking now about the two perspectives I tried to distinguish? I see. So the mirror image would be people who were conservative in politics, but disengaged and impartial in their personal lives? And are there such people?
I think that there might be people who are really very alone, who
Yes.
don't recognize any
Yes.
affiliation with family or
Yes. Well, that's very interesting. And maybe, this is not something that I feel I can speak about now, but maybe there's there's a parallel story to the one I'm telling. That is, maybe there are different answers to these ethical questions that I'm going to try and distinguish, such that if you gave those answers, you would end up with an austere personal perspective and a rather engaged and committed political perspective. That's a very interesting idea. I will try and think about that. Yes?
One more.
Yes. Well, I'm in favor of, let's say, extensionally in favor of interdisciplinary teaching. In other words, I'm in favor of courses that draw on other disciplines as needed. I'm rather against courses that announce themselves as interdisciplinary, because that seems to me to put the cart before the horse. That is, the idea that we're going to bring two disciplines together should be something that emerges out of an issue. You see the need to turn. I mean, I was trying to argue this evening that we're being forced, to my mind, properly from political theory into what is normally been thought to be questions of ethics. And then I would suggest that some of these questions of ethics might drive us back into questions of psychology, motivational theory, for example. I mean, are we suggesting things that can't happen and so forth? And these questions might lead us, or different questions might lead us to economics. But would be driven, of course, by the issue as it matured. I fear that sometimes people proceed in the other way and say there ought to be a fruitful union between the study of the deconstructionist turn and the law of civil procedure, and set out to find it. But in general, I mean, that was all by way of a little bit of unnecessary detour. The answer to your question is yes, I'm in favor of interdisciplinary work. Well, we'll stop. I'll take my notes.
I'm trying to protect him, and he doesn't need protection. Thank you so much.
Thank you.